Jonathan Lee Riches investigates. I am covering the Bryan Kohberger Moscow, Idaho case. Bryan Kohberger currently behind bars, and his recent filings by his defense, they're trying to get the indictment dismissed and get him released from jail. Highly doubt that is possible. They are using old 1850 case law, kind of like this old jail cell here, right? They're using old law to try to justify that the grand jury was not properly impaneled or the grand jury didn't do a true bill correctly. You think he's going to get out of jail and get that indictment dismissed? Highly doubtful. He actually wants a preliminary hearing in the alternative. Doubt that he'll even get that. Bryan Kohberger most likely will be spending the rest of his life behind bars like this, right? And this is an old jail cell back in the 1800s, believe it or not. And criminals would be put inside these cells. And this is the type of cell Bryan Kohberger will be subjected to the rest of his life. Just concrete walls. Let me spin the camera around. Look at that. And he'll just look out. Might be in a jail or a prison with a catwalk. Now, some people wonder, where will Bryan Kohberger spend his prison time if he gets convicted? And I think he'll get convicted. Well, will he be in the Idaho Department of Corrections, or will Idaho work with another state and do a interstate compact agreement where sometimes other states let the inmate go to another state to serve their time? That's quite a possibility when it comes to the Kohberger case. He's from Pennsylvania. Will they say, hey, we'll ship you to the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections? Definite a possibility. Another thing I'm hearing, if he gets the DP, and you guys know what the DP stands for, he will stay in Idaho and serve his time alone in solitary confinement in just an enclosed room and not get out. Now, solitary confinement, there's arguments whether that is unconstitutional or not. Let me show you a little bit about solitary confinement, because Kohberger, if he's convicted, will most likely spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement, whether that's in a prison out of state, Idaho, maybe even Gitmo, maybe even Guantanamo Bay, right? This old prison here reminds me of Guantanamo Bay. And some people say, okay, yeah, ship Kohberger to Gitmo. He's an enemy combatant. He did an act of terrorism in Moscow, Idaho. You can argue that. But here's some information about solitary confinement.
So here's an article. Federal Appeals Court upholds ban on unconstitutional conditions on Virginia death row. A federal appeals court has declared that Virginia for many years housed its death row prisoners in unconstitutional conditions and has barred the state from reverting to its prior practices. On May 3rd, 2019, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit ruled that the Commonwealth's former policy of 23 or 24-hour per day solitary confinement of death row prisoners constituted cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment. So here's one federal court saying that death row solitary confinement is unconstitutional. Here's an article in Wikipedia about solitary confinement in the United States. The United States penal system, upwards of 20% of state and federal prison inmates and 18% of local jail inmates are kept in solitary confinement or another form of restrictive housing at some point during their imprisonment. Solitary confinement, sometimes called protective custody, punitive segregation, or room restriction, generally comes in one of two forms: disciplinary segregation, in which inmates are temporarily placed in solitary confinement as punishment for rule breaking, and administrative segregation, in which prisoners deemed to be a risk to the safety of other inmates, prison staff, or to themselves are placed in solitary confinement for extended periods of time, often months or years. In Bryan Kohberger's case, most likely would be administrative segregation. What do you think? Unconstitutional, or is it legal? What's your opinion on solitary confinement in prison or jail?
Now, do you think solitary confinement is unconstitutional or not? And if you think it's unconstitutional, what are you asking for if Bryan Kohberger gets convicted and has to spend the rest of his life in prison? If he doesn't get the DP, should he be able to get out of his cell, out of that room, and mingle amongst the general population? I'm not so sure, right? Maybe another inmate might take a swipe at him, maybe they'll just put him in solitary confinement for his own safety. I don't advocate violence whatsoever, but that's definitely a possibility. So hopefully you got some insight about solitary confinement. This is an old jail cell. And when I just visited here, it reminded me of Bryan Kohberger. Most likely going to be sticking his hands outside one of these bars asking for porridge, right? The guards feed him 3 meals a day, probably, water and porridge, right? His hands through there with his little tin cup. Sometimes they say inmates bang their cups. Ding, 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 ding. This doesn't echo. Covering the Moscow, Idaho case. Subscribe my channel, hit the notification button. Prison sentence. Where will Bryan Kohberger spend his time? We'll talk soon. Stay tuned.